Good evening, and welcome back. Pull your chair a little closer, wherever you are right now, whatever hour it is, whatever part of the world you're listening from. I want you to take a breath and settle in. If you're somewhere cold, good. If you're somewhere the rain is coming down against the window, better. If you're alone and the house is quiet, best of all. Tell me where you are sometime, in the comments, or wherever it is people leave those words. Because this one is the kind of story that deserves to be received somewhere still, somewhere a little dark. Tonight, we are going to talk about water. We are going to talk about the world ending and the world beginning again. About the thing that has been told so many times, across so many centuries, that it has stopped being a story and become something else, something closer to a confession. We are going to talk about the flood. Not one flood, all of them. Because here is the first thing you need to understand, and it is the thing that will unspool everything else that comes after. There is no culture on earth, no civilization that left enough words behind to be read, no oral tradition that has been transcribed and studied and shelved in a university library somewhere that does not have a flood story. Let that settle for a moment. Sumerians, Babylonians, Akkadians, ancient Greeks, the Hebrew tradition, Hindu epics, Zoroastrian texts, Chinese mythological cycles, Norse cosmological schemas, indigenous nations across both American continents, dozens, hundreds of them, independent, speaking languages that share no common root with each other or with anything else. Polynesian island cultures, separated from the nearest landmass by thousands of miles of open ocean. Aboriginal Australian traditions, some scholars now date as the oldest continuous cultural record on Earth. Every single one of them, at some point, said this: the water came. The world was unmade. Someone survived. And from that survival, everything began again. That is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of human storytelling, or it is not a coincidence at all. We will get to the dark truth. We will get there slowly, the way water gets somewhere, not all at once, but continuously, finding every crack, filling every low place, arriving before you notice it has arrived. First though, we need to go back, all the way back to before the flood, because the flood does not make sense unless you understand what existed before it. And what existed before it is, well, it is the whole of creation, which is to say, it is everything. Let us begin at the beginning. In the oldest stories that have come down to us, the Sumerian traditions, encoded in cuneiform, on clay tablets, baked by accidents of history into something like permanence, the universe began with water. Not as a metaphor, as a literal fact. Before anything was made, there was only the deep, the primordial ocean, which the Sumerians described as a kind of indistinct totality, a merger of the sweet water below, which the Babylonians who inherited this tradition would call Apsu, and the salt water above, which they would call Tiamat, two vast bodies existing in a kind of ancient, pre-creative embrace. They were not gods in the way we use that word now, not personalities with appetites and grudges and favorites, but forces, oceanic, impersonal, complete, They were the beginning because there was nothing else. There was only them, and the mingling, and the silence, and whatever silence means when there is no ear to register it. Out of that mingling came the first generations of beings, more defined, more shaped, younger and noisier and more restless. And here we encounter the first great theme that will recur throughout everything that follows, as all the deepest themes of this story recur, like water finding the same path down a hillside after every rain, the theme of generational incompatibility. What generates cannot contain what it generates. The parents of the cosmos are, by the nature of cosmic generation, enemies of their own children. This is not a uniquely Mesopotamian insight. It is the foundational recognition of every mythology that tries to account for how things change, how old orders fall, how the new world is always built over the ruins of whatever preceded it. The Babylonian tradition, which inherited and elaborated and in certain ways darkened the Sumerian material, the way every inheriting civilization darkens what it inherits, adding centuries of accumulated anxiety to the original story, tells us that Apsu, primordial freshwater father, grew enraged at the noise of the younger gods. He could not sleep. The clamor of their existence disturbed the stillness that was all he had ever known. He wanted to destroy them. He said so openly, and Tiamat, the salt ocean, the vast mother, initially resisted this impulse. She said, "Let them be. They are young. They are full of themselves. They will settle." But Apsu would not be calmed, and his counselor, Manu, urged him on, and plans were made in secret. The younger gods learned of those plans, because secrets never hold, because the gods, like the people who invented them, cannot keep a secret when the secret concerns their own survival. Enki, whose name will appear again and again in this telling, the way a watermark appears again and again when you hold a page to the light, always in the moment when someone needs a way out, that the situation seems to have closed off. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water and magic and craft, acted first. He put Apsu to sleep with a spell of such deep enchantment that it drew Apsu's own sleepy nature against him, turned the restful waters into a trap, and then Enki killed him in his sleep. And having killed him, he built his own dwelling on the body of the slain primordial father. Enki's sacred house, the Abzu, the freshwater depths that would become his domain and his workshop, was constructed on the corpse of what had been the first thing. The first act of cosmic architecture was built on a killing. This is not a small thing, and the tradition knows it is not a small thing. This is the foundational act of cosmic violence, the first deicide, the murder that makes the world possible. Every order requires the destruction of what preceded it. Every dwelling is built on something that was alive before. Tiamat did not forgive this. The transformation that followed was terrible and slow and then sudden. Her grief became fury. Her fury became purpose. Her second consort, Kingu, was raised up as champion and given the tablets of destiny to wear around his neck. Those tablets that encoded the fates of all things, the operating instructions of the universe. and an army was fashioned from her body and her rage. Monsters, serpents, the dragon goddess of raging storms, beings whose faces were like those of no creature that walked on earth. She was not simply angry. She was remaking herself into a weapon. The primordial ocean, which had been passive and generative, became something that intended to take back what had been taken from it. What is being described here, underneath the divine drama and the mythological spectacle, is something every tradition of cosmogony gestures toward in its own vocabulary. Creation is violent. The universe is not made from nothing, conjured from divine goodwill into an empty and welcoming space. It is made from the death and dismemberment and transformation of what came before. Every new order requires the destruction of the old one. Every birth is, in some sense, a killing. Every civilization is built on something it did not ask permission to build on. Marduk faced Tiamat. He was young, magnificent, chosen by the gods to be their champion, with the promise that if he won, he would rule them all. He drove a wind into her open mouth so she could not close it. The image of this is extraordinary. A god using the primordial mother's own openness against her. The gesture of speaking and receiving turned into suffocation, and he drove his spear through her, and she was split, and from her body he made the world. From her eyes, the Tigris and the Euphrates. From her skull, the vault of heaven. Her ribs became the arching ceiling of the sky. Her tail became the Milky Way. Her breasts became the mountains. The world is the body of a dead god. The sky we look up into is the skull of the defeated mother. The rivers we drink from are her eyes. When it rains, those are the waters of her body, finding their way through the cracks in the ceiling her corpse has become. Let that land. Let the full weight of that cosmological image arrive. If the world is the body of a primordial water entity, then the flood is not a punishment visiting an orderly world from outside. The flood is the world's original nature reasserting itself. The water was always there. The water was there first. What we call the world, the dry land, the order, the civilization, the cities with their grain stores and their kings and their accountants and their records pressed into clay, all of it is a temporary imposition on something that was water before it was anything else, and that still is water, underneath, pressing upward through the floor of the universe, waiting for the structural integrity of Tiamat's skull to fail. The Enuma Elish, which is the name scholars give to the Babylonian creation epic. The name means "when above," which is its opening phrase in Akkadian, in the way ancient texts were often named by their first words before the concept of titles existed, was written down sometime around the 12th century BCE, but it preserves traditions far older than its writing, traditions that were already ancient when someone pressed them into clay, traditions that may carry memories distorted and mythologized and transformed by the passage of oral transmission through hundreds of generations, but not wholly invented, not fabricated from nothing. Memories of a world in which water was genuinely more present, more threatening, more central to human experience than our contemporary world, with its levees and drainage systems and weather forecasting, allows us to easily imagine The Mesopotamian heartland, the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is what Mesopotamia means, land between the rivers, was one of the most flood-prone environments in the ancient world. The rivers flooded unpredictably, violently, without the regularity that the Nile provided to Egyptian agriculture. The Persian Gulf could push backward, inland, in surges driven by wind and tide. The flat alluvial plain offered no elevation, no natural escape route, no high ground between the settlements and the water. A major inundation was not an unusual catastrophe in this part of the world. It was a recurring threat, a seasonal dread, the shadow that fell across every harvest season and every building project, the thing you built your city above and your theology around. The gods who ordered this world were gods who had ordered it out of chaos, and chaos was water, and water was always pressing at the margins. In the Sumerian king lists, those extraordinary documents that list the rulers of the great cities before and after the flood, with the same matter-of-fact administrative tone a modern municipal accountant might use for quarterly budget reports. There is a line, a single phrase, that has haunted scholars for more than a century. Then the flood swept over. Before that line, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After that line, the numbers come down. They become human-sized. They become the kind of numbers a person can count to. And history, as we understand history, the measurable thing, the thing with records, the thing that can be verified against other records, begins. The flood is the threshold between myth time and history time, between the world as it was dreamed and the world as it was lived. On one side of that phrase, beings who cannot die. On the other side, us. Now we must speak of power, and of the gods who had it, and the gods who wanted it, and the deal they made with creation, and the price that deal eventually demanded. The ordering of divine authority in the great Mesopotamian traditions is a story of negotiation as much as conquest. After Marduk defeated Tiamat and built the world from her body, there was still the question of what to do with the gods who had followed her, the host of the defeated side. The answer was not extermination, or not entirely extermination. The answer was hierarchy. The answer was work. You are defeated, but you will not be destroyed. You will maintain. You will labor. You will dig the canals, keep the rivers in their banks, hold the sky in its place, ensure the mechanisms of the world function without ceasing. But the gods, even the defeated ones, were not made for labor. They were made for the stillness of the primordial deep, or for the freedom of divine will. They grew tired. They grew resentful. The work went on for what the texts describe as 40 double hours each day, meaning constantly, without rest, and the burden was total and without end, and it broke them, slowly, the way sustained impossible labor breaks anything, even beings who were never supposed to be breakable. They complained. They organized. They burned their tools. They gathered before the house of the great gods and demanded relief. Enki, always Enki, the clever one, the one who finds the third path when everyone else sees only two, who looks at an impossible situation and asks what would happen if you tilted it slightly. Enki proposed a solution. Create beings to do the labor. Create servants who are mortal, who will wear out and be replaced, who will sweat and suffer in the service of maintaining the divine order, so the gods do not have to. Create something new from what exists. The creature was made from clay, mixed with the blood of a god. Not just any god. Kingu, Tiamat's champion, the one who had worn the tablets of destiny around his neck like a terrible inheritance, was slain for this purpose. The blood of the defeated divine general was mixed with clay, the oldest substance, the ground itself, and from this mixing, humanity was made. Hold on to how this feels. In the oldest story we have about our own creation, we are a labor-saving device. We were made so the gods could rest. We were made from clay and the blood of a war criminal. We carry divine nature in us, a fragment of something that was a god, and we carry the earth in us, and we are neither one thing nor the other. We are the hybrid, the compromise. We were born already in between. The gods rejoiced when humanity was made. The burden was lifted. The divine assembly relaxed. The world ran smoothly for a time. The canals were dug and maintained. The temples were built and provisioned. The offerings were made. And the gods ate and rested. And this was, for a while, a good arrangement for everyone involved. But we multiplied. This is the thing that no divine administrator had adequately planned for. We reproduced. We filled the earth with our noise and our smell and our ceaseless motion and our prayers and our arguments and our music and our grief. What had been created as a manageable workforce became something unmanageable. Not because it was rebellious or wicked or ungrateful, but simply because it was alive, and life, given the chance, generates more life, and more life generates more noise, and the oldest of the gods found themselves back where they started, unable to sleep, the quiet of the primordial deep as far away as ever, the clamor of existence, pressing against every divine boundary they had tried to maintain. Enlil, Enlil the Great, Enlil the Storm Lord, Enlil who sat at the head of the divine assembly, and whose word was, theoretically, absolute. Enlil decided to end us. The decision is presented in the text with a bluntness that is shocking. He did not call a trial. He did not issue a warning. He assembled the gods and declared that humanity had to go, and that was that. And if you find this morally troubling, the text does not appear to have anticipated your objection. He sent plague first. The number of people on earth diminished. The surviving people prayed, desperately, to every god simultaneously. And here, the story introduces the figure who will thread through the entire flood tradition, like the name of a song you keep almost remembering, Atrahasis, whose name means something like extremely wise or surpassing sage, which, in these traditions, is never an accident. Names announce fates. Atrahasis advised the people not to pray to every god simultaneously. Instead, he advised them to focus all prayer, all sacrifice, all religious attention on Namtar, the god of plague, and to neglect all the others entirely. The logic was unnerving in its precision. A god who is receiving all the offerings feels the weight of all those prayers like a debt and cannot easily go forward with the plan he was already implementing. The prayer was not sincere petition, it was divine pressure. It was, in modern terms, lobbying, and it worked, and Enlil was furious. He sent drought next. The rivers dried, the crops failed, the people prayed, all prayers directed at Adad, the rain god, and none to anyone else. Same trick, same result. The drought ended. Enlil's fury deepened. He sent famine. The tactic again, concentrate the prayer. The famine broke. Enlil had run out of instruments. He had nothing left in his administrative toolkit except the ultimate option. He convened the gods in secret, because some of them, Enki included, would have argued against what he was about to propose, and he extracted from them a solemn oath not to warn humanity of what was coming. The flood. Enki, who had made humanity, who had given the gods rest by creating us, who perhaps felt something like the particular complicated regret of someone watching a thing they built be unmade by someone else's decision. Enki could not bear it, but he had sworn the oath. He was bound by the assembly's decision. He could not speak to any human being directly. He went to the house of Atrahasis, specifically to the reed walls of the house, the reed enclosure that separated inside from outside, that divided the human domestic space from the world. And he spoke to the wall. He addressed the reed structure. He told the wall what was coming. He told the wall to relay a message to the man who lived inside. Pull down your house and build a boat. He described dimensions. He described provisions. He described everything necessary. And Atrahasis heard. Of course he heard. He was always listening. He was the man who, every time catastrophe came, found the angle, found the thing everyone else had missed. He heard through the wall what he was not supposed to know, and he did not question the strange channel through which the information arrived, and he began to build. His neighbors asked what he was doing. The texts record that they came and asked, and that there were negotiations. Some versions suggest Atrahasis told them there was a divine plan to relocate him, that he was building on instructions from Enki, and that he distracted them sufficiently that the work continued. He was not dishonest in the way a liar is dishonest. He was managing the information. He was the kind of man who understood that too much truth, too early, can stop the necessary work from being done. The descriptions of the flood in the Atrahasis epic, even in translation, even stripped of whatever music the original Akkadian carried in the mouths of the people who first told it, are worth sitting with. The storm that came was not a storm in any sense we use the word. It was the sky and the earth, unmade from each other. It was Marduk's division of Tiamat's body being reversed, the architectural separation of her upper waters from her lower waters collapsing, the foundations of the world giving way, and the ceiling of the sky giving way, and the two original oceans finding each other again through the gap where the world used to be. The Anunnaki gods, the great gods of the underworld, raised their torches and set the land ablaze with light. Then darkness swallowed everything. Adad roared from within the clouds. Shulat and Hanish, gods of storm, led the assault. The flood covered the mountains. The people could not see each other. They were indistinguishable, even to themselves, in the water, and the gods were afraid. This is something the later, more theologically confident traditions tend to lose. The gods of the Atrahasis epic were terrified by what Enlil had unleashed. They crouched at the edge of heaven. The great goddess Nintu wept, mourning the people she had helped to create, whose clay and divine blood bodies had come in part from her hands. The other gods wept with her. They were hungry too. The smoke of offerings was gone, the temples underwater, no incense rising, nothing burning on any altar anywhere. The divine economy, which depended on the labor and piety of humanity, just as humanity depended on divine order, had been shut down. The gods were cold and hungry and afraid of what they'd done, or what they'd allowed to be done in their name by one of their number who had been angrier and more powerful than the rest. You do not precisely aim the ocean. You do not give the water instructions. You open the door and you hope. The flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights. On the 8th day, the storm broke. The sun appeared. Atrahasis opened a window and the light came in, and he looked out over the world, and the world was water. He wept. He made offerings immediately: wine, beer, cedar, myrtle. The gods smelled the sacrifice. They came like flies, the text says. This comparison has bothered commentators since the first modern translations. Gods coming to an offering like flies come to something sweet or rotten. It is a simile that deflates, that punctures the dignity of the divine in a way that feels deliberate, feels like the text knows exactly what it is doing. These are gods who caused the death of nearly every living thing. And here they are, drawn by the smoke of a man's gratitude, swarming the fragrance like insects. There was a reckoning. The other gods turned on Enlil. Enki, no longer bound by the oath since the flood had already occurred, and the secret no longer existed to keep, said what he thought of the whole enterprise. The tradition suggests, and this is the word to use, suggests, because the tablets are damaged and fragmentary, and scholars reconstruct as much as they translate. The tradition suggests that limits were placed. New mechanisms were proposed for managing the human population that didn't involve drowning everything. Death would do it. Infant mortality would do it. Celibacy for some. Demons who took children. The world after the flood would be harder in specific, calibrated ways, and that hardness would prevent the population crisis from reaching the level that had made Enlil reach for the last resort. The terms of the new world were negotiated in the smoke of Atrahasis's offering. Now, Gilgamesh, the greatest literary monument of the ancient Near East, the text that contains the most fully realized version of the flood story, the epic that George Smith translated a fragment of in 1872 and then wept over, reportedly, actually wept, in public, in the reading room of the British Museum, which is not how scholars typically behave, but which seems like the correct response to discovering that a 3,000-year-old clay tablet from a destroyed library under the ruins of a destroyed city had been waiting in the dark to tell you that a story you thought was uniquely yours was far older than you'd understood. Gilgamesh was king of Uruk, 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. a proportion that should be mathematically impossible, but that the tradition offers without apology, and which perhaps is telling us something about the arithmetic of mythology, that it operates in different dimensions than ordinary counting. He was beautiful. He was terrible. He exhausted the young men of his city with endless competitions and wrestling matches and expeditions and demands. He claimed the right of the first night with new brides. The people of Uruk cried out to the gods for relief from their own king, which is one of those details that no later tradition reproduces because it is too uncomfortable. The model of civilization, the great city builder, was experienced by the people in his city as a force of oppression. The gods made Enkidu in response. They made him as a kind of counterweight, a check on Gilgamesh's overwhelming nature. They made him wild, a creature of the steppe, raised among animals, drinking from the same pools as the gazelles, knowing nothing of civilization except that it must be somewhere on the other side of the horizon. A temple prostitute named Shamhat was sent to find Enkidu and civilize him. She lay with him for 6 days and 7 nights, and when it was over, the gazelles ran from him because he smelled different and moved differently, and the watering hole where he'd drunk was no longer familiar to him because he had crossed a threshold he hadn't known was there, and now he was something he hadn't been before. This is the first entrance into civilization in the epic, and it is described as both a gain and a loss, both a becoming and an unbecoming. Enkidu grows wiser, stronger in some ways, diminished in others. He can no longer run with the animals. He belongs to the human world now. They met at the entrance of a wedding house. Gilgamesh, on his way to exercise the rite of the first night, Enkidu, standing in the door to block him. They fought in the street, the two most powerful beings in the known world, and the city shook, and the doorposts rattled, and the walls trembled, and they were matched. They were equal, and in that moment of equal force, met with equal force, something happened that the tradition struggles to name clearly, and which subsequent traditions have sometimes been uncomfortable naming at all. They loved each other. They fell into love the way people fall into a river they didn't know was there. The epic follows them through great deeds: the cedar forest, Humbaba, the bull of heaven, triumphs that were also transgressions, victories that were also provocations. The gods watched, and some of them were pleased, and some were not, and the ones who were not were powerful enough to matter. Enkidu got sick. The sickness came from nowhere, that the text identifies precisely. It is the kind of sickness that has a divine cause, that represents the universe adjusting to an act that went too far. He dreamed. He dreamed of the underworld, and the dreams were not reassuring. He cursed the gate that his hand had touched. He cursed Shamhat, who had changed him into a creature capable of dying, and then Shamash the sun god reminded him from the sky that without Shamhat there would have been no Gilgamesh and no greatness, and Enkidu took the curse back. He died anyway. Gilgamesh would not permit the burial for 7 days and 7 nights. He sat beside the body. He said, the text says, directly, that he wept bitterly over his friend. He said, a maggot fell from his friend's nostril. That is what told him Enkidu was gone. Not the stopping of breath, not the stillness of a face. A maggot from the nose. This is either the most devastating detail in ancient literature, or I have spent too long staring at these translations and have lost the ability to judge. Perhaps both. After 7 days, he let the burial happen, and then he left. He put on the skins of a lion because he was in mourning, and he went into the wilderness because where else is there to go when what has happened has happened? He wandered, and he thought about the thing he had never thought about before, the thing that civilization had insulated him from, with its walls and its rules, and its assumption that people like Gilgamesh were different, that the divine portion in him would protect him from what the mortal portion was heir to. He was going to die. He wandered, and he looked for ways not to. He found scorpion men at the ends of the earth and passed through their mountain. He found Siduri the alewife at the edge of the world, and she gave him the most human advice in the entire epic. She told him to eat good food, drink good beer, look at the child who holds your hand, embrace your wife, let the ordinary life be what it is, because he didn't listen. He found the waters of death, which surround the island where Utnapishtim lives in his impossible immortality, and he crossed them with the ferryman Urshanabi. Utnapishtim, whose name means he found long life, told him the flood story, the whole of it. And then he gave Gilgamesh the test that should have told him everything. Can you conquer sleep? If you cannot conquer sleep, which is the image of death, how will you conquer death itself? Gilgamesh sat down intending to stay awake and immediately fell asleep. And Utnapishtim had his wife bake a loaf of bread for each day he slept. So when Gilgamesh woke up and insisted he'd only dozed for a moment, there were 7 loaves at various stages of staleness and 1 fresh one to prove otherwise. He had been asleep for 7 days. He wept again. He said, "What do I do now?" The hero who could not be defeated by any human or divine enemy had been defeated by his own weariness. Utnapishtim's wife felt sorry for him. She asked her husband to give Gilgamesh something for his trouble. Utnapishtim told him about a plant at the bottom of the ocean, a plant that restored youth, called something like Old Man Becomes Young Man. Gilgamesh tied stones to his feet and dove to the bottom and found it. He brought it up. He didn't eat it immediately. He was going to bring it back to Uruk, to test it on an old man first, to make sure it worked before he took it himself, which is either admirable caution or tragic delay, depending on how you read it. A serpent stole it while he was bathing. The serpent slithered away, shed its skin. This is the old explanation for why serpents shed their skins, an association that runs through many traditions. The serpent as the creature that renews itself, and disappeared into the water. And Gilgamesh wept again, for the 3rd time in the epic, sitting beside the channel he'd been bathing in, his hands empty where the plant had been. He went home. He looked at the walls of Uruk. He told Urshanabi the ferryman to walk around them, to measure them, to admire them. He is asking a stranger to witness the only permanence he has, not his body, which will die, not his deeds, which will fade from living memory, the walls, the stone, the city, his name, which he had inscribed on a tablet in a box of lapis lazuli and put in the wall of the city's foundation, so that if you knew where to look and could read what was written, you could find him. This is what the flood story gives Gilgamesh, not a way to avoid death, a way to understand what to do with the time before it. Build things that outlast you. Write your name somewhere someone might find it. Now Atrahasis, the extremely wise one, whose story I told briefly in the context of Enlil's decision, but who deserves to stand in full here, because the texture of his intelligence is unlike any other hero in any tradition I know. His wisdom is not the wisdom of the sage. It is not detached, contemplative, seated. It is relentlessly practical, almost ruthlessly so. Every time a crisis came, he assessed the system and found the pressure point. The plague. The pressure point was the god of plague, who could be paralyzed by concentrated devotion. The drought. The pressure point was the rain god. The famine, same approach. Each time Atrahasis looked at the structure of divine authority and found the place where divine pride could be used as a lever. When Enki spoke through the wall, Atrahasis did not waste time marveling at the fact that a wall was speaking to him. He processed the information. He gathered what he needed. He managed the social situation with the neighbors, kept them busy, kept them present enough not to alarm, absent enough not to interfere. He organized the loading of the vessel with the precision of someone who has thought about this problem before, or who has the kind of mind that generates systematic solutions automatically without visible effort. He survived because he was the right kind of person, and I want to be careful about what I mean by that. He was not the most righteous. He was not the most beloved by the gods. He was not the strongest, or the most beautiful, or the most divinely favored in any conventional sense. He was the most awake, the most attentive, the one who, when the universe sent a signal through an unconventional channel, received it and acted on it rather than dismissing it because the channel was weird. This is a different model of heroism than anything that came after it. It is a model in which the hero's great quality is not courage or virtue or divine connection, but attention. The willingness to take seriously the information that comes to you, no matter the form it takes, and to act on it quickly and systematically and without excessive grief about the implications. Atrahasis did not weep when he heard the flood was coming. He built the boat. The post-flood Atrahasis is less discussed than the pre-flood one. He made offerings. He negotiated, through the medium of those offerings, a new arrangement with the divine world. And the new arrangement was harder than the old one, in specific ways, as I mentioned. Death, child mortality, divine affliction, calibrated to control population. But it was an arrangement, a covenant of sorts, even if it was less warm than the rainbow kind. The world would continue. Humanity would be permitted to exist within constraints. The relationship was renegotiated, and both parties returned to their respective domains. Atrahasis disappears from the tradition after this. He doesn't become immortal. He doesn't receive a special placement at the edge of the world. He simply goes away. The text ends. The tradition doesn't track him to any particular exit. He was extremely wise, and he survived the flood, and he renegotiated the terms of human existence, and then presumably he died, in the way that mortals die, in the world he had helped to save. There is something about that understated ending that feels right, that feels like the truth of most survival. You go through the thing, you do what has to be done, you build the next version of the world, and then you are part of it, and the world continues, and eventually you are just a name on a tablet someone finds later. Now Ziusudra, the earliest, the name the Sumerian tradition preserves from the oldest layer of this material. Ziusudra, whose name carries in it the phrase long life, or he who prolonged life, depending on your translation, who was the last king of Shuruppak before the flood, who had reigned for a span that would sound like fantasy if we tried to fit it into a human lifespan, who was described as deeply, habitually pious in a way that went beyond mere religious performance. He watched, he listened at every threshold. He tended every relationship with the divine, with the careful attention of a gardener who understands that the plants will not grow without daily care. And one day a wall spoke to him, the same wall, perhaps, or a different one, or the same tradition finding its shape in an earlier text. And Enki told him that the divine assembly had decided, and that the flood was decreed, and that he should build. He built. The texts are fragmentary here, damaged, and we lose the details of construction. What we have is the flood itself, described with the same overwhelming totality that the Babylonian version captures. The storm that blotted out the sun, the wind that howled across the great waters, the violence of the water against everything that had been built. Then Utu, the sun god, appeared, opened a window in the storm, and Ziusudra opened a corresponding window in the boat, and the light came through, and he prostrated himself before the light, and killed a bull and a sheep, making offerings of blood and fire in the midst of the water, on the deck of the vessel in which everything alive was contained. The gods gave him eternal life. They placed him in the land of Dilmun, to the east, where the sun rises, where every morning begins, not at the edge of the world, as in the Gilgamesh tradition, at the origin point, at the place where light starts. This is the Sumerian flood survivor, a man of such continuous, habitual, sincere piety that when the information came, through whatever channel it came, he received it and acted and survived and was rewarded by being placed at the beginning of every day. He is where morning comes from. The man who survived the end of the world lives at the place the world starts over. Every day is his. Now Manu, who is perhaps the most surprising of these figures, because his virtue is the most mundane. A fish came to him, small, asking for protection. He put it in a jar. It grew. He moved it to a river. It grew more. He moved it to the ocean. It told him what it was. It told him what was coming. Vishnu, the preserver, the one whose cosmic office is to maintain the world between its periods of creation and destruction, the one who appears in each age in an avatar appropriate to that age's crisis. Vishnu appeared to Manu in the form of a fish, and the crisis of that age was the flood, and the appropriate avatar was a great fish who could tow a boat through the waters of the world's end. Manu gathered what he was told to gather: seeds, the 7 rishis, the sages, the keepers of knowledge. He built the vessel, he waited, the waters came. Matsya Vishnu towed the boat north, through the catastrophe, until the waters receded and the vessel rested in the mountains, and Manu stepped out onto the wet, clean earth. What Manu did next separates him from every other flood survivor in the comparative record. He wrote, he dictated or composed or received. The tradition is complicated on the distinction. The laws of Manu, one of the oldest and most influential legal and ethical texts in the Hindu tradition, a document that shaped South Asian legal philosophy for well over 1,000 years, that encoded the rules by which the reconstructed world would govern itself. He built not just with seeds and animals, he built with principles. He understood that surviving the flood was only the first act. The second act was preventing the conditions that made the flood necessary. The laws of Manu are not universally admirable. They encode hierarchy in ways that subsequent generations have struggled with, have resisted, have tried to reform, have used against each other. They are a real document with real consequences, not an idealized code from a golden age, but their existence in the tradition, the fact that the flood survivor is simultaneously the lawgiver, says something important about the tradition's understanding of what flood survival means. It means responsibility for what comes after. It means that the person who makes it through the water has an obligation to think about the shape of what they're building. Manu was ordinary in the specific sense that his extraordinary virtue was the accumulation of ordinary good acts, helping small creatures who asked for help, paying attention when unusual things happened, building what he was told to build, gathering what mattered, and carrying it through. He didn't have Gilgamesh's divine portions, or Atrahasis's tactical genius, or Ziusudra's decades of royal piety. He had decency and attention and the willingness to act on what the information implied. These are the 4 shapes survival takes in the tradition: the king who learns what immortality costs, the wise man who finds every angle, the pious king who is placed at the place of beginning, the ordinary man who helped a fish. All 4 of them built something. All 4 of them passed something on. The great convergence, the flood itself, the central event around which all these individual survival stories orbit, comes now, and I want you to feel the weight of it. Not the weight of one flood, the weight of all of them at once, simultaneous, every tradition telling the same story in its own vocabulary, the same water rising in every language. In the Hebrew text, the water comes from 2 directions, from the fountains of the great deep that burst open in the earth, and from the windows of heaven that open in the sky. This is the cosmological division: the water above the firmament and the water below the earth. Those primordial bodies that existed before creation gave the world its boundaries, those divisions collapsing. The world that God made by separating the waters in the first chapter of Genesis is the world that unmakes itself in the 6th chapter. The same waters that the creative word divided are the waters that the creative word withdraws from, and in the withdrawal, the division fails. Noah had been given very specific instructions. The ark was not round. It was not the coracle shape of the Mesopotamian versions, that round vessel that suggests surrender to the water, drifting, passive, trusting the current. The Ark of Genesis is a rectangle, a box, 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 tall, coated inside and out with pitch. 3 decks, a door in the side, a window near the top, covered somehow, opened after 40 days. No rudder, no sail, no mechanism for navigation, because navigation was not the point. The God of this tradition steers, Noah contains. The loading was meticulous, 2 of every kind, or 7 pairs of the clean animals, and 1 pair of the unclean, or, and this is where the seams of the 2 source traditions show most clearly, both, depending on which voice you're hearing when you read. The animals came to Noah. He didn't hunt them down. They came. This detail matters. In the tradition, the cooperation of the animals in their own preservation is itself a kind of miracle, a sign that the natural world recognized what was happening and chose, in its animal way, to participate in survival rather than simply be overwhelmed by catastrophe. The rains lasted 40 days. The waters prevailed for 150. The earth was covered to a depth of 15 cubits above the highest mountains, a number precise enough to suggest someone who measured, or imagined measuring, the depth of the water above what should have been visible. Everything that had the breath of life in it, outside the ark, died. The text says this plainly. The text does not look away. Then God remembered Noah. This phrase, God remembered, is one of the most significant in the entire flood narrative and is also one of the most misread. It does not imply that God had forgotten in the way a distracted person forgets a name or an appointment. It implies that after a period in which the divine attention had been elsewhere, withdrawn, the flood running its course without divine intervention, the divine attention returned and was directed toward the specific person and the specific vessel floating on the specific water. Staines remembered Noah means the phase of destruction is over. The phase of restoration begins. The flood begins to recede. Noah sent out a raven. The raven, which eats carrion, which can find food in a world of death, flew back and forth, but did not return. Then a dove, which is more delicate, which needs living things to eat and green branches to rest in. It came back. 7 days later, again, and it came back with an olive branch, the living wood of a living tree, the first sign that somewhere, not far, the world had surfaced. 7 more days, and the dove flew out and did not return, because it had found a world to live in. The ark rested on Ararat. The mountains showed their tops. Noah opened the covering of the ark and looked out. God said, "Go out, come out, bring out, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth again." These are the same words as the creation. The same commands given to the first humans are given again to the first post-flood humans. The world is being recreated, and the instructions are the same. And the question the tradition seems to be holding, but not asking directly, is, will it go the same way this time? Is there something different about these humans, or about this arrangement, that will prevent the slide back into the state that made the flood necessary? Noah made an offering. The aroma reached the divine presence, and the divine presence was moved by it, and made a decision: never again. The covenant of the rainbow, never again by water. The rainbow has entered human symbolic vocabulary so completely that we have forgotten it was invented, or rather, first interpreted, in this moment. Before Genesis, rainbows were just atmospheric phenomena, or were perhaps ominous, associated with the bow of a god who might be aiming. In Genesis, the rainbow is explicitly said to be a bow set in the clouds, God's own weapon, now pointed upward, away from the earth. A warrior who has put down his weapon and said, "Not again." The bow is still there, the weapon still exists, but it has been set down. And then Noah got drunk. This part that nobody talks about, this part that the children's illustrated version skips entirely, that the Sunday school lesson moves past quickly, that the popular imagination has not absorbed because it is so inconvenient to the story that wants to be told about Noah as an uncomplicated righteous man, the faithful servant of God, the hero of the flood. Noah planted a vineyard. He made wine. He drank too much and lay naked in his tent, which is a human and undignified and recognizable thing to do. The kind of thing a man does when he has been through something enormous, and the enormous thing is over, and there is nothing left to do but feel the weight of it. His son Ham came in and saw him, and went out and told his brothers. His brothers Shem and Japheth walked in backward and covered their father without looking, refusing to see what Ham had seen. When Noah woke and knew what Ham had done, he cursed Canaan, Ham's son, to be the lowest of servants. This curse is the part that has the longest shadow, not the rainbow, which promises that the world will survive. The curse, which predicts that certain children of the world will serve others. The first act of the post-flood patriarch is a curse. The first institution of the rebuilt world is hierarchy. The flood washed away everything, and the first thing reconstituted when the world dried was the domination of one group of people over another, and the first ideological justification for that domination was the word of a man who had survived the end of the world and whose authority was therefore absolute. This is the dark truth behind the flood story in its Hebrew version. The covenant is real, the rainbow, the promise, the divine self-limitation, and it coexists in the same chapter, in the same text, almost in the same breath, with the production of a pretext for slavery. Later interpreters, and this is the scholarly consensus, not a fringe position, later interpreters constructed from the curse of Canaan a racial ideology identifying Ham's descendants as Africans and the curse as divine justification for the enslavement of African peoples. The flood story, which begins as a story about survival against impossible odds, which ends with a rainbow covenant, contains within it, in the drunken aftermath of the survivor's celebration, the seed of one of the most catastrophic applications of theological argument in human history. I need to pause here. The shadow of this is long. The institutions built on that interpretation lasted for centuries, in forms that are still being dismantled. And the text itself, the text cannot be held responsible for what its readers made of it across millennia of motivated interpretation. But the text is not innocent either. The curse is in there. The hierarchy is in there, in the oldest surviving layer. The flood that was supposed to clean the world left a mark on it in the very moment the survivor stepped out. Now let us move outward again. Let us hold the Hebrew tradition alongside the Greek and the Hindu and the Mesopotamian and see what the whole picture shows us, because the comparison is where the dark truth becomes visible in its full shape. In the Greek tradition, Deucalion survived a flood sent by Zeus, who had looked at the world in the Bronze Age and found humanity violent, deceitful, and irredeemable. Zeus wanted to destroy humanity with thunderbolts first, but worried. The text actually says this. Zeus worried about setting Olympus on fire. He chose water instead. The choice between fire and water for the instrument of divine punishment recurs in multiple traditions and is one of those structural rhymes that suggest something deeper than coincidence. The next time the world ends, some traditions suggest, it will be fire. The current world, the water world, the post-flood world, sits between two catastrophes. Prometheus warned Deucalion, his son, the titan who had given fire to humanity, who had been punished for that gift with eternal torment, chained to a rock with an eagle eating his liver every day, a punishment so excessive that even the tradition seems uncomfortable with it and eventually has Heracles end it. That titan, who had already given humanity one of the things that made us capable of civilization, gave us one more thing, the warning, the knowledge that the catastrophe was coming, the chance to build the vessel. Deucalion and Pyrrha floated for 9 days and 9 nights. The number 9 appears in Greek tradition as the number associated with completion and with extreme duration. 9 is how long things take when they take as long as they need to take. At the end of 9 days, the chest came to rest on a mountain peak, Parnassus or Othrys or Athos, depending on which tradition you're in, and Deucalion opened it and looked out over a world of water. He sacrificed to Zeus. He prayed. He asked the oracle of Themis how to restore what had been destroyed, and the oracle said, "Throw the bones of your mother." The answer Deucalion reasoned to, that the bones of the Earth Mother are stones, is the kind of answer that reveals something about how the tradition thinks about the relationship between human beings and the ground we come from. We are the earth, made temporarily animate. We are stones that have been warmed into motion. Our bones are the same substance as the substrate we walk on, and when we are remade from that substrate, from the stones thrown over the shoulder without looking, the deliberate act of not looking at the creation while creating, which is perhaps the most honest description of how creation actually works. You throw something in a direction and you see what lands. They threw stones. People grew from the stones. Deucalion stones became men. Piras became women. Humanity was remade from the bones of the earth in an act that was both ritual and practical, both sacred and deeply physical. The new people literally coming out of the ground, literally continuous with the material substrate of the world, not descended from some original exalted couple, but grown directly from the earth, like things that grow. This origin has consequences that the Greek tradition never fully explores but always implies. We are not special in the way we sometimes imagine we are. We are the earth, knowing itself for a while, and when we die, we return to what we were before. The stones will become people again. People will become stones again. The flood is part of the cycle. I want to talk about cycles because the Hindu tradition and the Chinese tradition and the Norse tradition and several of the indigenous American traditions offers a framework that the Abrahamic traditions, with their emphasis on linear history moving toward a final judgment, have difficulty accommodating. The idea that this is not the first world, not even close. In the Hindu cosmology, time moves in cycles of almost incomprehensible duration. Yugas, kalpas, mahakalpas, units of time that dwarf human historical memory the way the ocean dwarfs a puddle. We are currently in the Kali Yuga, the last and most degraded of the 4 ages of a cosmic cycle, the equivalent of Hesiod's Iron Age, but grounded in a temporal framework that makes the Greek scheme look like a weekend. The Kali Yuga will end, the world will end with it, and then another cycle will begin, with another Satya Yuga, another golden age, another period of perfection that will gradually, inevitably, degrade toward the next Kali Yuga. The flood, Manu's flood, the great inundation at the end of an age, is not unprecedented in this framework. It has happened before. It will happen again. Vishnu will appear in an appropriate avatar, will guide whoever needs guiding through whatever catastrophe is current, and the world will restart. This is not cause for despair in the Hindu framework. It is simply how the universe works. The universe is not created once. It is created and destroyed, and created again, continuously, in a rhythm so vast that individual civilizations exist within a single breath of the process. The Norse tradition has its own flood, or rather, its own version of the world's end, Ragnarok, which includes the world being swallowed by water. The sea rises. The serpent Jormungandr, the world serpent who encircles the earth biting its own tail, releases that tail and the oceans pour in. After Ragnarok, the world rises again, new, clean, green. 2 humans survive, Lif and Lifthrasir, hidden in the world tree, surviving the end by being in the right hiding place, fed on morning dew, preserved without quite knowing they were being preserved. They come out into the new world, and they repopulate it. The pattern holds. The pattern always holds. Anyway, what am I trying to say with all of this? What is the point beneath the comparative mythology and the theological analysis and the literary appreciation of texts thousands of years old? What is the thing that made me want to do this particular episode, on this particular night, in this particular season? I think the dark truth, the thing the title promises, is not that the floods were real, although some of them may have been. It is not that the gods were cruel, although some of the traditions portray them that way. It is not even that the survivors built unjust worlds on the ruins of the old ones, although they did. The dark truth is this: every civilization currently in existence, every culture that produced the people listening to this, is built on the ruins of something that drowned, not necessarily literally, but the pattern of mythological thinking across every tradition that has been studied long enough to yield this pattern is a pattern of catastrophe, survival, and reconstruction. And the reconstruction is always imperfect, and the imperfection is always known, and the knowledge of the imperfection is what produces the story. We tell flood stories because we know the world has ended before. We tell them because we know it can end again. We tell them because the act of telling is itself the thing that Atrahasis did, listening through a wall, receiving the information that the catastrophe is coming, doing what needs to be done so that the seeds and the knowledge and the names can make it through. You are the ark, if you are listening. That is not a metaphor designed to make you feel important. It is a description of what listening to these stories does. When you receive the story, when you take into yourself the name Ziusudra, the detail of the maggot, the image of the gods crouching at the edge of heaven like dogs, the rainbow that is a bow put down, you are carrying those things through time. You are the vessel. And when you tell someone else, or when you write it down somewhere, or when you simply think about it carefully and let it change the way you see the world, you are continuing the transmission. The transmission has been going for 5,000 years in written form, for longer in oral form, for longer still in whatever the pre-linguistic equivalent of storytelling is. The gesture, the rock painting, the specific arrangement of bones that says to whoever finds it, something happened here. Remember, there is a specific quality of attention that all the flood survivors share. Call it readiness. Atrahasis was ready to hear what he wasn't supposed to hear. Ziusudra was ready for the dream that would change everything. Manu was ready to recognize a god in a small fish. Noah was ready to build something that made no sense in clear weather. Deucalion was ready to act on a riddle that seemed to demand an impossible thing. Manu was ready to write the laws the new world would need before the new world had fully dried. They were all, in their different ways, paying attention to the signals that the world sends when it is about to change, when the pressure behind the wall is building, when the fish is larger than it should be, when the neighbor's noise is covering something that needs to be heard in silence. We live in a period that is not low on signals. I will not say more than that. I will not draw the contemporary application out to its conclusion, because the story should do that work, and if it doesn't do that work in the listener, no amount of explicit statement will accomplish it. I will only say, the traditions agree that there are people who hear through walls, and that these people are not extraordinary in their virtue or their divine connection, but in their attention, and that when the wall speaks, the appropriate response is to start building. The scholarship continues. New tablets are found. Gilgamesh tablet fragments, recovered in the last few decades, have added scenes that weren't known before, have deepened our picture of Enkidu's death and Gilgamesh's journey. Archaeological work in Mesopotamia, much of it suspended by decades of conflict and instability in the region, has produced evidence that the city of Shuruppak, Ziusudra's city, the last antediluvian city in the king lists, shows clear evidence of a major flood layer in its stratigraphy. The flood deposit is real. Something happened at Shuruppak. Whether it was the flood that the tradition remembers or one of many floods that accumulated into a single mythological memory, the archaeology and the mythology are pointing at each other across a gap of 5,000 years. The Black Sea hypothesis remains contested. The evidence for a catastrophic late Pleistocene inundation of the Black Sea basin has not been confirmed as unambiguously as its original proponents suggested. But the hypothesis opened a conversation that is still productive. The question of what geological events might underlie mythological memories and how long such memories can be reliably preserved in oral tradition. Some researchers now argue that certain Aboriginal Australian oral traditions preserve accurate memories of events that occurred during and after the last ice age. Sea level rises that occurred between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago, specific coastal transformations, specific geographic changes. If this is true, if human oral tradition can preserve accurate information about events 12,000 years in the past, then the flood stories of the ancient Near East, which are much more recent than that, may be preserving something genuinely remembered, not invented, not purely mythologized, remembered. The species has a longer memory than we think. The story we keep telling is older than we know. The water we keep describing rose, once, maybe many times, and the people who survived it told their children, who told their children, who pressed it into clay, who copied it onto parchment, who translated it into other languages, who published it in books, who read it into the ears of people sitting in the dark with the rain against their windows. The last thing, the thing about the flood stories, the thing that distinguishes them from pure tragedy, from the kind of narrative that would simply be too heavy to carry through time, is that they all end with something planted, something built, something written. The survivor does not simply survive. The survivor produces. Manu writes the laws. Noah plants the vineyard. Deucalion throws the stones. Atrahasis makes the offering that renegotiates the divine-human relationship. Gilgamesh builds the walls and inscribes his name. The act of production is the act of survival's completion. You are not finished surviving until you have made something that will outlast you, until you have put something into the world that carries the knowledge of what happened and what it cost and what it means. This is what the story is doing. Every time it is told, it is planting itself. Every iteration is a seed in a box on a boat on the flood, and the flood is always passing, and the world is always surfacing, and morning is always arriving from the direction where Ziusudra lives, at the place where the sun starts. The Chinese flood traditions deserve more than a footnote, and I am giving them more. I have been moving too quickly past them. This is one of the places where I've been uneven with my attention, spending too long with the Mesopotamian material, and the Hebrew, and the Greek, and the Chinese tradition is vast enough, and strange enough, and important enough that to skip past it would be the narrative equivalent of what happened to the world when the flood was happening, a drowning of something that deserved to be on the boat. The figure at the center of the Chinese flood tradition is not a single hero, but a pair, and the relationship between them is one of the most psychologically complex in any mythological tradition dealing with this subject. Gun was the first to try to control the flood. He failed. His son Yu succeeded. The story of their relationship, father and son, failure and success, death and resurrection, and redemption through the work of the next generation, is as moving as anything in the tradition. The flood in the Chinese system did not come from the sky or from divine punishment. It came from the earth itself, rising, the waters finding their own level after some primordial disruption, inundating the land and threatening the world from below rather than above. The Yellow Emperor commissioned Gun to manage the flood, to stop it, to make the land habitable again. Gun attempted to do this by stealing divine earth, a substance called zirang, a kind of self-expanding soil, miraculous growing earth that would grow to fill any space from the divine realm without permission. He used it to build dams and dikes, fighting the water by opposing it directly, trying to hold it back with barriers. The method didn't work. You cannot hold water back by building walls against it, at least not indefinitely, not at the scale of a mythological flood. The water finds ways through and around. Gun failed and was executed for the failure and for the theft of divine property, and his body lay on a northern mountain for 3 years without decaying. When his body was cut open, by divine command, or by a celestial sword, or by the intervention of some force that the tradition does not entirely agree on, Yu emerged from it, not metaphorically, literally born from the opened body of his failed father, born from death, born from failure, born from the corpse of the attempt that did not work. This is the mythological truth about what genuine improvement costs. Yu did not simply succeed where his father failed, as if the problem were simple and his father had been incompetent. Yu succeeded because he learned from his father's failure, because he had the failure to learn from, because the father's body, which had tried to fight the water and lost, contained within it the person who would understand that you do not fight water, you channel it. Yu worked for 13 years to control the flood. The texts are emphatic about the physical cost. His hands lost their calluses, grew hard and then harder, became like the hands of something that has worked for too long. His legs lost their hair from being in water constantly. He is described as having a peculiar gait, a limp or an awkward walk, that some scholars associate with physical damage from years of work in the field. He was the model of labor, the anti-aristocrat, the leader who did not direct from a comfortable seat, but got into the water with the workers. 3 times, he passed the door of his own house and did not go in. 3 times, his wife was inside, His children were being born and growing up while he was in the water. He did not go in because the work was not finished, and going home when the work was not finished would have meant prioritizing his own comfort over the survival of the world, and Yu was not that kind of man. His method was the opposite of his father's. Instead of building walls to hold the water back, he dug channels to let it go. He worked with the water's nature rather than against it. He found the paths the water wanted to take and made them easier, widened them, deepened them. Let the water run where it wanted to run, but guided that running away from the inhabited places, away from the fields and the cities, toward the sea that was its natural destination. He became famous in the Chinese tradition as the founder of hydraulic engineering, and the traditions about him are encoded in some of the oldest geographical knowledge that survives from ancient China: the names of rivers, the descriptions of mountains, the knowledge of where the water flows and why. When the work was done, Gun's failure and Yu's success had between them transformed the relationship between Chinese civilization and the water that surrounded and threatened and fed it. The lesson was not that humans can defeat water. The lesson was that humans can cooperate with water, can redirect it, can turn its energy from destruction toward cultivation. The flood, in the Chinese tradition, does not end with a covenant between humanity and the divine authority that sent the flood. It ends with engineering. It ends with knowledge. It ends with the understanding that the water is always going to flow, and the question is where. Yu became the founder of the Xia dynasty, the first dynasty in Chinese historical memory. The emperor who came before history, who made history possible by making the land habitable, who was born from his father's failed corpse and spent 13 years in the water and came out of it as the founder of a civilization. His limp became, in the tradition, the Gate of Yu, a ritual shuffling step used by shamans and ritual specialists, a way of embodying the founder's sacrifice, a reminder in the body of the practitioner that the civilization they are working within was paid for by someone who never came home while the work was undone. Now let me say something about the Norse material, because the Norse vision of the flood, or rather, the Norse vision of the world's end, which incorporates flood as one of its elements, is the most comprehensive eschatological framework in the European tradition, the one that takes the mythological logic of catastrophe and renewal and pushes it to its fullest cosmological elaboration. The Norse world was created from the body of a giant. Ymir, the primordial being, was killed by Odin and his brothers, and from his body the world was made. Flesh became earth, blood became ocean, bones became mountains, skull became sky. The structural parallel with the Babylonian Tiamat is not coincidental. Comparative mythologists have tracked the resonance for more than a century. The world is made from a murdered body. The flood, when it comes at the end, is the ocean, which is Ymir's blood, returning to itself. Before Ymir was killed, his sweat generated the first humans, or the first giants, depending on the version. And after his death, 2 humans were made from trees on the seashore, Ask and Embla, ash and elm, given breath and blood and color and life by the divine brothers who had made the world from the murder. These are the humans who will survive Ragnarok, hidden in the world tree. Life and Lifthrasir, she-life and life enthusiasm, or perhaps life and life yearning. The tree's grammar being ambiguous in the way that names in these traditions are always ambiguous. They drink morning dew. They sleep through the end of everything. They wake up into the new world, the green world, the world that surfaces after the fire and the flood and the silence. The Norse tradition is unusual in that it is specific about the mechanism of the world's end in a way that other traditions are not. We know the names of the participants. We know the order of events. We know that the world serpent will release its tail and the seas will overflow. We know that Fenrir the wolf will swallow the sun. We know that Odin will be swallowed by Fenrir and that Thor will kill the Midgard serpent and take 9 steps and fall. We know the specific defeats of the specific gods, catalogued with the precision of a battle historian, writing up the order of march. And then the world surfaces, new, green, silent. The surviving gods find each other in the wreckage. The 2 humans emerge from the tree. A new sun rises. The daughter of the old sun, born before her mother was swallowed, has been waiting somewhere beyond the edge of the known world, and now she takes the sky. Everything begins again. This is the most structural rendering of the pattern I know. Birth from destruction, new from the death of old. The cycle turning, not because it is inevitable in a fatalistic sense, but because it is the nature of things, because the world that was made from a body will return to body and be remade from body, and the humans hidden in the tree are the seed that makes the remaking human rather than simply geological. The Mesoamerican traditions, Aztec, Maya, and their predecessors elaborate this cyclical vision into one of the most complex cosmological systems in the comparative record. The Aztec tradition held that the current world was the 5th sun, the 5th iteration of a cosmos that had been created and destroyed 4 times before. Each previous sun had ended in catastrophe, the first in darkness, the second in wind, the third in rain of fire, the fourth in flood. The 4th sun, the water sun, was ended precisely by a great flood, and the 2 humans who survived it, Nata and Nena, were warned by Tlaloc, the rain god, and survived in a hollow log. But the 5th sun, this world, the current world, was built differently, from an act of divine self-sacrifice so radical that it reconfigured the relationship between gods and humans. The gods gathered at Teotihuacan in the darkness after the 4th sun's flood, and 2 of them sacrificed themselves to become the sun and the moon, and the sacrifice created an obligation. The sun and moon thus made required continuous nourishment to keep moving, to prevent the world from ending in stillness and darkness. This is the darkest application of the flood and reconstruction pattern in the comparative record. The survivors of the 4th sun's flood inherited not the covenant of the rainbow, but the covenant of blood, the obligation to keep feeding the mechanism that had been built to replace what drowned. Every civilization is built on something, And what the Aztec civilization was built on was the explicit acknowledgement of that debt. The flood ended a world. The new world was bought with a price that had to be paid continuously. I am not making an argument about whether the Aztec system was right or good or justified. I am making an observation about what the mythological logic requires. That the survivors of the flood are not simply saved, not simply given a new start on clean terms. They are survivors, which means they owe something to the thing that let them survive. The question that every post-flood tradition wrestles with, in its own way, is what that debt is and how it should be paid. The Hebrew tradition says, keep the commandments, build a just society, remember the covenant. The Hindu tradition says, live according to Dharma, the law that Manu wrote, the cosmic order that Vishnu preserves. The Greek tradition says, be pious, make the offerings, do not overreach as the Bronze Age humans overreached. The Aztec tradition says, pay in blood, continuously, because the machinery requires it, and the world will stop if you stop paying. These are all answers to the same question. What do survivors owe? What is the price of being the ones who made it through? There is one more thing I want to say before we reach the end of this. One more shape of the dark truth that the flood stories contain. It is the thing about the animals. Every flood tradition that involves a vessel, not just the Mesopotamian and Hebrew versions, but variants across multiple cultures, includes animals in the vessel. Two of every kind, or some animals, or the domesticated animals, or the animals that matter. The animals are preserved alongside the humans. The flood is not a human catastrophe that incidentally affects the non-human world. It is a total catastrophe, a catastrophe of the living world, and the survival is the survival of the living world, not just its human members. Noah's Ark, as a cultural image, has been enormously generative in visual art, in literature, in scientific and ecological thinking. The idea of a vessel that contains all necessary life, that preserves what would otherwise be lost, that crosses the waters of catastrophe to deposit its cargo in the new world. This image has been applied to everything from libraries to seed banks to space arks imagined in science fiction. The ark is the universal image of deliberate preservation in the face of inevitable loss. The real-world seed banks, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, the various national seed repositories, the frozen zoos of genetic material, the efforts to preserve endangered language recordings, the digitization programs for crumbling archives. These are all, in some recognizable sense, flood response strategies. They assume the catastrophe. They are built in advance of the worst. They are the work of people who have read the tradition carefully enough to understand that the information and the seeds and the genetic diversity need to be in a safe place before the water rises, not after. In 2016, the Svalbard Vault, built into Arctic permafrost that was supposed to be permanently frozen, flooded with meltwater. The water did not reach the seeds. They survived, but the permafrost had melted in ways the architects hadn't anticipated, because the warming they designed around was outpacing the models they'd used. The ark needed repairs. The ark needed to be improved. The ark is always, in some sense, being built for the last catastrophe rather than the next one. This is the most contemporary of the lessons the flood tradition has to offer, and it is the one I have been most careful not to say too directly, because the directness would flatten it. The tradition is not allegory. It is not a series of environmental policy recommendations encoded in religious narrative. It is something prior to that, something more foundational. It is the species recording, in the most durable medium available to it at any given time. Clay, papyrus, parchment, oral memory, now digital storage. The recognition that the world ends, that it has ended before, that the ending is survivable, and that survival requires preparation, attention, and the willingness to look ridiculous building a boat in clear weather. The flood water recedes, the mud dries, the olive branch appears, and the survivor plants something. That is the end of the flood story, not the rainbow, the planting. Everything after, all of civilization, every city, and every library, and every legal code, and every piece of music, and every poem, and every piece of grain stored against the coming winter, everything is the growth that follows the planting, that followed the flood, that ended the world, that was made from the body of whatever was killed to make it. We are downstream from catastrophe. We have always been downstream from catastrophe. We are here because someone listened to a wall, or helped a fish, or noticed the dove had not come back, or reasoned from a strange oracle to an unlikely answer. We are here because enough of them made it through, because the seed survived, because the names were written somewhere that the water didn't reach, and the water is always at the margins, rising. This is the last thing I want you to carry out of this, not dread, but the quality of attention the survivors had, the readiness, the listening, the willingness to build before the rain starts, to gather the seeds while they are still dry, to take seriously the information that comes to you, in whatever form it comes, however strange the channel, however unlikely the messenger. The wall will speak. The fish will grow beyond what fish grow to. The dove will fail to return, and then return with a branch, and then fail to return again. You will know what time it is. You will know what to do. The water came. Someone survived. They left you this. Let me speak now about memory itself, because the flood stories are, at their root, stories about what memory can survive and what it cannot. The tradition of flood mythology is itself an act of flood survival. The stories are the things that were saved, the cargo of the cultural ark, and the question of how they survived and what they lost in the surviving is as interesting as anything in their content. The clay tablet that contains the flood story from Atrahasis is damaged. This is true of almost every ancient text that deals with the flood. The very stories about survival from destruction have themselves only partially survived destruction. The Gilgamesh flood tablet was broken when it was found, missing sections, the gaps filled in by scholars who note what is missing with the careful notation of people who understand that the absence is as meaningful as the presence. The Sumerian king list that contains the phrase, then the flood swept over, was found in multiple fragmentary copies that don't entirely agree with each other, each copy a separate survival of a separate tradition, each offering a slightly different version of the same truth. This is not merely an academic observation. It is a structural fact about the nature of mythological transmission. The stories that survive are always partial, always reconstructed, always collaborative acts between the ancient voices that first told them and the modern scholars who piece together what remains. The flood story you know, whatever version you know, whatever tradition shaped your encounter with it, is already a reconstruction, already an interpretation, already someone's best effort at preserving what could be preserved. And this means that the flood stories are not finished. They are still being made. Every translation is an interpretation. Every retelling makes choices about what to emphasize and what to compress. Every comparative study that puts Atrahasis beside Noah, beside Manu, beside Deucalion, and asks what they share is making an argument about what the deepest truth of the tradition is. I have been making that argument tonight, and you have been listening to it, and what you take away from it will be different from what someone else takes away. And in that difference, the story continues to live. The ark is not a fixed object. It is the act of carrying. You carry it differently than the person who told it to you carried it, and the person you tell it to will carry it differently still, and the story mutates as it travels through time, picking up the concerns and the anxieties and the wisdom of each age that handles it, losing some details and gaining others, always recognizable, never identical. This is how oral traditions work. This is, in a deeper sense, how all tradition works. What the flood stories have preserved through 5,000 years of carrying is not primarily a historical record. It is not primarily a theological statement. It is primarily a shape, the shape of catastrophe and survival, the shape of warning and preparation, the shape of destruction and rebuilding. And shapes, it turns out, are more durable than content. The specific names and the specific numbers and the specific animals on the specific boat are less important than the pattern they encode. And the pattern is this: when the worst happens, the question of who survives is determined before it happens by the choices made in the time before. The survivor is always the one who was paying attention before the flood, not the strongest, not the most favored, not the most powerful, the most attentive, the one who listened to walls, the one who helped a fish, the one who watched every day at every threshold, who was so thoroughly oriented toward receiving signals from the world that when the signal came through an unusual channel, it was received rather than dismissed. This is, if you will accept the stretch, a theory of civilization. Civilizations that survive are civilizations that were attending to the signals of their own fragility before the fragility became catastrophic. Civilizations that fail to survive, or fail to survive in recognizable form, which is perhaps the more common outcome, are civilizations that were too confident in their own permanence to maintain the quality of attention that survival requires. The flood story keeps getting told because the lesson keeps needing to be told. Not because we are stupid, not because we are forgetful in some culpable way, but because the lesson is genuinely hard to maintain across generations. Each generation has to relearn it from its own flood, its own catastrophe, its own version of standing on wet ground, looking at what the water left behind. The tradition is the attempt to make that relearning faster, to hand the knowledge forward so that the next generation doesn't start from zero, so that some portion of what was learned survives the transmission. We are the transmission. This is what I mean when I say, you are the ark. And the ark, as I have said, and as the tradition says, is not a passive vessel. It is not simply a container that happens to float. It is built with purpose, loaded with intention, guided through the catastrophe by something, divine will in some traditions, engineering knowledge in others, the accumulated wisdom encoded in the cargo itself. The ark is active survival. It is deliberate preservation. It is the decision made in advance about what matters enough to save. What are you carrying? What are you an ark for? These are not rhetorical questions in the way that rhetorical questions are usually not really questions. They are genuine, and they have specific answers, and the specific answers tell you something about what kind of survivor you are preparing to be, or not to be. The person who knows what they're carrying and why is better prepared than the person who has never thought about it. The tradition is not subtle on this point. Atrahasis knew exactly what he was loading. Manu knew exactly what seeds and which sages. Noah knew the dimensions of the vessel and the provisions necessary for the duration. The knowing is part of the survival. There is a form of cultural preparedness that the flood stories are teaching, and it is not the bunker mentality version that sometimes gets associated with survivalist thinking. The idea that you stock up enough canned goods and wait for the worst. It is something more like, know what you value, know why you value it, know how to transmit it, know who you are going to be responsible for in the time of the flood, and make that decision now, not when the water is at your door. The ancient world encoded this knowledge in myth and in ritual. The Sumerians pressed it into clay. The Hebrews incorporated it into the central narrative of their theological tradition. The Greeks dramatized it in epic poetry performed at public festivals where the entire community was present to receive it. The Hindus embedded it in texts that were memorized and recited and taught as foundational knowledge across millennia. The transmission was not casual, it was institutionalized. It was treated as important enough to be performed regularly, to be taught to children, to be the subject of serious theological and philosophical elaboration. We have not entirely abandoned this. The flood story is still taught. It is still performed in religious contexts, in artistic contexts, in the kind of popular culture engagement that this podcast represents. The telling continues, but the institutional seriousness with which earlier cultures treated the transmission has become harder to maintain in a world where there are so many other things demanding attention, so many other stories competing for space in the cultural memory. The flood story competes, now, with everything else, with every other story that has ever been told, with every other form of entertainment and distraction and information. And it survives this competition not because it is loud or spectacular, though it can be loud and spectacular, but because it is true in the way that things are true when they describe something that is actually happening to the people encountering them. The flood is always happening, in one form or another. The water is always at the margins. The quality of attention the story demands is always in short supply. And this is why I think the tradition keeps being transmitted, even now, even in this form, even through this strange medium, because the people who encounter it recognize it. They hear it, and something in them says, I knew this. I didn't know I knew it, but I knew it. The pattern was already in me, waiting for the shape of the story to make it visible. You already knew the flood was coming. You knew before I said it. You knew it the way Atrahasis knew it through the wall, not as information from outside, but as something heard through the medium of your own attention. The wall speaks. Are you listening? The water was always there. The water was there before everything. The division between the waters above and the waters below is maintained by the same structures that maintained it before. Structures built from what was killed to make the world. And those structures have been under pressure, as they always have been, as the tradition has always insisted they are. The world was made from the body of something that is not entirely dead, and what is not entirely dead can reassert its original nature. This is not apocalypticism. It is not nihilism. The tradition does not counsel despair. The tradition counsels attention and preparation and the specific kind of courage it takes to build something in clear weather that will only be necessary if the worst happens. That is a strange kind of courage. The courage to prepare for what everyone around you is not preparing for. To build the thing that makes you look ridiculous until the moment it makes you the only one who survives. Atrahasis built the boat. His neighbors asked questions. He gave answers that were true enough to be technically accurate and incomplete enough not to cause panic. And he kept working. He kept loading. He kept the work moving because the work was what mattered, not the explanations for the work, not the social management of how the work appeared to people who didn't know what he knew. We live in an age that has access to more information about the state of the world than any previous age in human history, and also more mechanisms for converting that information into noise, into distraction, into the background hum of unprocessed signal that makes it hard to hear the specific important thing that needs to be heard. The wall is speaking all the time. The skill of Atrahasis, the skill the flood survivor has in every tradition, is the skill of distinguishing signal from noise, the skill of hearing what matters through the interference of everything else. I cannot teach you that skill. I do not have it completely myself. No one does. It is cultivated through practice, through the habit of attention, through the repeated choice to listen carefully rather than quickly, to sit with what is being said long enough for it to say what it actually means, rather than what you first thought it meant. But I can tell you that the tradition exists, that it has been maintained for 5,000 years by people who understood that something was worth maintaining, and that what they were maintaining was not primarily a story about water. It was primarily a story about how to be the kind of person who makes it through. So, the floor is wet. The world is the body of something that died to make it. The water above and the water below remember each other and press toward reunion through every crack in the ceiling of the sky. The gods were afraid of what they started. The man who built the boat in clear weather looked ridiculous until he didn't. The dove came back with a branch. The covenant was made. The laws were written. The name was pressed into the wall of the city's foundation where someone might find it. The flood was real. The flood is real. The flood will be real. And someone will survive it. And they will plant something. And one morning, many years later, someone will find the tablet in the ruins, and they will read it, and they will weep in the reading room of wherever the reading rooms are by then, and they will understand that the story they thought was theirs was much older and much wider and much more necessary than they had known, and they will start to tell it again, because the telling is the survival, and the survival is the telling. And this is what the flood is about. This is what it has always been about. Good night.